My name's Todd Painter. In case you haven't met me before, I work for Microsoft as a solution engineer focused in data and AI, of course, and pretty much anything. If you're at Microsoft these days, you're somehow working with AI one way or another. But my usually thing I'm doing day to day is helping customers get started in Fabric. And if they say they want to get started in AI, I'm usually talking about AI on the Azure side of the house and how we're presenting it through Fabric and things like that too. But what that means is a lot of companies I work with and companies that I used to work for, and I know the state that a lot of them still are in, is they never really invested in a true data strategy, in my opinion. And so now with AI really firing up being yet another leg that is hungry for data, people are struggling now to say when they built their first kind of AI processes, for instance, they're really struggling to get good results. And that's, you've probably seen lots of articles and comments on LinkedIn and everything out there talking about how important it is for your data to be good. Well, it's always been important, because if you wanted to build dashboards and make business decisions and all those things, nothing's really changed. You need a good data to help you do that. And, solid data, you could trust that, the answers are correct and all that. But now AI is really exposing that. And so now we're having yet another round where people are saying, well, how do I get started on a true data strategy? And I see, chief data officers getting hired at companies who've never really truly led a data strategy. They just kind of had a little bit of a data background, but then their CEOs are telling them, hey, we need a true data strategy. You need to invest in cloud data services and things of this nature. And they're really struggling to get started. So now that's, bigger companies that have bigger budgets. It's great to say, go invest in a cloud data platform such as Fabric or Databricks or Snowflake and all the choices that have been around the last few years. But for other companies, more mid-size and especially smaller size, they might say cost alone is a reason they can't quite go there from day one or something. So, and another thing I'll say is I went to the SQL Saturday here in St. Louis a few weeks back or a couple months back. And some of the feedback I heard there was things were a little light on SQL Server. It's called SQL Saturday, right? But a lot of talk of AI, a lot of talk of BI and Power BI, a lot of talk of Fabric, of course, but not a lot of sessions on SQL Server, and especially not on how would I manage data if I don't have one of these big platforms to work with. So I felt this could be a good subject just to kind of walk through if you're a Microsoft shop and you're looking for other options. So, the agenda I put together here, I'm sitting here, I'm going to try to keep this to about 70 minutes max so we can leave time at the end for discussion here if anybody has things to discuss. Or, if they're just questions and want to see more things, I can kind of react to that and show some more things, etc. I want to walk through here. The very start here is, in my personal opinion, what do I think is the best model for data management? This is something that can be highly debated, so that end section there, if anybody wants to debate me on that, what they think could be better than what I'm saying, go for it, because there is no one answer. That's why I say it's an opinion, right? Then I say, I am going to give a Fabric overview here. I'm not going to go quite as in depth as I normally would with somebody, just because really you need an hour minimum to really get into all the features of Fabric and things like that. But I really do want to go through some of the features just for anybody who hasn't maybe seen some of this before, especially the things that matter for managing your data, and then what some of the end game you get for that investment you're making. And then you see here that I'm going to go into, what are the other options out there, whether it be in the cloud or even still on premises, because there are still some companies out there that say, hey, I'm not, quote, allowed to go to the cloud. If you ask them why they say they're not allowed, most of the time the answer is, well, everybody just thinks we can't go to the cloud. It's usually not a real solid reason, but given that, it doesn't matter what the reason is. If people think they can't, then they can, they won't. So that said, we'll touch on a little bit of what's, kind of with SQL 2025 and things like that. Maybe how things can change, between that and previous versions and things of that nature too. So that said, let's just launch into the very first part of this here, where when I say data management, I just kind of want to level set What I think, if you're talking true data management, it all starts with you have to centralize your data. And when I say centralize, what I'm showing here is that on the left-hand side, I could have a bunch of databases. I could have Excel files, any data source you have out there. This could be cloud applications you could gather data from, HR systems more and more are becoming, all in on cloud, CRM systems, all those things, like the big players out there are all, kind of software as a service, cloud-based things. So you could be grabbing data from there. But in my opinion, terms like data mesh that have popped up the last few years and things like that, to me, it all starts with, okay, it's great. You can say, let's not truly centralize our data, build processes to pull data from a SQL server and Oracle server into one central repository. But if you don't do that, the downsides to me have always been just plain flat out operations management. That if you put more load on your application servers, those application servers are not going to work as well. Your IT team is going to spend more time troubleshooting issues on that end. And so what I'm talking about here is, for instance, let's say you have 15 applications in your environment that need an employee list. Well, you could go to your HR system 15 times and pull that out every day and push it to 15 systems, but now you're running that query 15 times. When I say this here, you're pulling it one time into a data warehouse. And now, so on here, you can see that I list some of the uses of your central repository, including a common term is something like operational data store. Well, to me, that's what I'm talking about here is if I want to push that employee list out 15 times, do it from this central server, not from your application server where it's, you built those servers to power that application. You set up a cloud environment that, is going to meet the needs of everyday use, but it's not going to meet the needs of trying to push data out and process it 15 times. And so more important than ever, mentioning AI once again, where are your resources going to come from to build AI processes? Most companies don't have extra budget that's sitting around to say, let's invest in 5 more employees to help me build AI processes. To me, you can't be putting more load on your application servers, making your IT team work even harder to get into. You're never going to get started with AI unless you fix some of that stuff. And so when I say, I just really believe in this concept of truly centralizing your data into one repository, then it's going to meet the needs of that I'm listing here, including, number one, great, I've built a data warehouse. I'm going to put all my data in here. I walk through the operational data store. Of course, analytics and reporting and building dashboards and all the traditional things you do with tools like Power BI, Tableau, Click, etc. Then, of course, data science is becoming bigger and bigger too, like people wanting to do predictive analytics. And so when we talk about AI today, mainly we're talking about large language models and things of that nature, but old school data science, building machine learning models, trying to predict what's going to happen. Large language models don't necessarily help you too often with that, especially when it's a mathematical thing. So data science is becoming more and more important as well. And so, commonly one of the downsides, if you don't build a centralized data repository, or even if you do it with on-prem, is you get into this place where, hey, I've got to start building copies of that data for different uses because the data scientists come in, they say, I want to use a big set of your data. You say, hey, I'm afraid you're going to destroy my application or my data warehouse if I allow you in. So you build yet another copy of data. And this is one of the values I'm going to walk through as I'm going through Fabric, is that the way these more modern platforms are built, you truly only need one copy of data for everybody. And that's a huge bonus. It doesn't quite sink in until you have time to let that bake a little bit and and figure out what we're talking about when we say that. And then, of course, like I said, AI-driven processes. If your company isn't started doing it already today, they will be, because your competitors are already starting, and pretty soon you're going to find out that they're getting even more efficient and they're taking even more market share. And the reason's going to be because they're getting more efficient by using large language model AI, and you have to catch up, and eventually everybody will be. And when you get there, if you're not starting today with building a better data strategy, you're not going to be in a very good place. So anyway, any questions or thoughts on any of that before I move on to just kind of walking through Fabric a little bit? Okay. One thing, you see purview, I put up here really big on the slide as well, mainly just to represent that one way or another, centralizing your data technically is great, but what if nobody knows what that data means? Well, you need some sort of tool where you can define that. And I will say, a lot of companies that have even hired data governance directors and things of that nature, they haven't gone all in on investing in a tool to do that. Or if they have, they spend a few $100,000 or even millions in some cases for a tool, and they don't take the time to fill in the details. And to me, it's going to be more important than ever to take the time to do that. And there are strategies for doing that that don't put all the onus on your data team. You can democratize that in ways, but today's not a data governance conversation, but just saying that I will say Purview from the Microsoft ecosystem, there's a lot you get for free, and I'll walk through a little of that today as well. So, yeah. All right. So let's go through the Fabric here. So very first, I'm going to start real quick for anybody who hasn't seen this before. Fabric is powered by a set of compute called a Fabric capacity. And so that's the only thing you're ever going to set up in Azure. And so you see on the screen right now, I have this capacity. And the main thing I want to point out here is that number one, there aren't a whole lot of things to configure here. The only things to really decide are in Azure, what region do I want to put that in? And then once you've decided that, it's really just the size that I need. And I'm not going to bring it up here today, but Microsoft even provides a calculator out there to help you project like what size compute do I think I'll need in Fabric. And that really is for down the road. If you're saying I need a budget for the next year and know I need to pay for Fabric for the next year, then I need to know. And so the calculator gives you things like, hey, what size of data do you think you'll bring in by X amount of time? And how many reports are you going to build? How many users are going to use those reports? And when you plug all those numbers in, it comes back, and you can see here that you have these various sizes to pick from. And if the calculator came back and said, we think you need an F64, well, now you know your cost for Fabric because it's right there in your face. The way the cost model works for Fabric is we charge you for this compute capacity and we charge you for storage, and storage is at the rate of $23 per terabyte per month. And if you know much about storage in Azure, you'll know that's not a super high cost compared to some other things. And that's at a compressed rate as well. So if you bring in 10 terabytes of data, that might really only be 2 terabytes. So you're only we're charging you $45 a month or so for 10 terabytes of data in reality. So, but that's really all there is to understanding cost in Fabric. And then just in case you see these costs, and that's a little bit of sticker shock, like everything else in Azure, there is the concept of a reservation as well. So if you put a reservation on top of this, we're going to take about 40% off that cost. And that means for an F64 here, you're paying about $5,000 a month. That calculates to $60,000 a year, plus your storage now for a comprehensive data management system. And when I say a comprehensive data management system, I'm going to walk through what I mean by that here. So any questions on this capacity thing? The reason I show it is because there are some concepts I'm going to walk through here in a moment where it's pretty important to understand the way that this compute works. Because unlike some platforms where you say, hey, when I turn on the reporting tool, I'm going to get a separate bill for that. If I turn on an ETL tool to ingest data, I'm going to get charged for that. If I pick a certain type of storage, a database, whatever that might be. But with Fabric, it's all in, it's all inclusive, and Fabric includes all those components I'm talking about. And the only charge you get here is what size compute do I think I need to power that? And so that's why we have a calculator to help you figure that out. But the nice thing is too, you'll notice when you're starting from day one, you can start all the way down here at an F2 size, and you can just let that grow over time. And so, now you're getting charged $260 a month if it's running 24/7. That's another thing to know. If you don't have a reservation on this, then you can pay this list cost. You could turn off your Fabric capacity overnight on weekends, things like that, and we don't charge you while that's turned off. So that's another factor, while you're in development phase, especially, and you're growing, you don't have to go all in on saying, hey, I'm paying, 60,000 a year or 120,000 a year from day one. It can be as you grow and just, start from the very small here.
So the Fabric is a compute, you don't have any of the storage yet, or?
That includes the storage. So when in a moment here, I'll show like some of the storage mechanisms of Fabric. You get the storage just built right in. So you don't have to set up storage as a separate component. So Fabric is a software as a service approach to data. The reason we say that is because it uses ADLS Gen 2 storage in the background for its storage, but you don't have to set that up. You just set up this capacity here, and now the storage just comes with it. It's a little weird, right? Because traditional database thinking or even products like Databricks, you had to go out and configure certain components first, and then you stand up the product. But with this, it's all inclusive.
So is that the fast storage or?
We're definitely not going to give it bad storage because you understand, and you'll see here in a moment, like with some of the storage of Fabric, there aren't concepts like indexing, for instance. So if you think SQL Server, you say, if I want to build a data warehouse there, I'm building a lot of indexes. When I join 15 tables together and things like that, in Fabric, for some of the components, there's none of that. You ingest your data and you start writing queries and start doing your work. And what makes that happen, of course, is really good disk to start with. You have to have great storage, but then it's how the engines work as well, right? So. All right, so now let's get into the meat of this here. So for those who haven't seen this before, what exactly is Fabric? So everything else you do in Fabric, just notice here, I'm in powerbi.com now. And that's because when Microsoft set out to build this new thing, Fabric, they said, hey, who at Microsoft has been really successful when it comes to data? And some of you may have even used or be familiar with the fact we built a thing called Synapse Analytics that was out there. That was our big cloud offering for several years. And frankly, it just didn't meet the needs of bigger companies. It didn't perform as well as some needed. And it was a pretty good attempt at bringing all the components of data management in. But in my opinion, when I looked at it working at companies prior to going to Microsoft, I just kind of felt like, hey, I can do better just using Azure SQL if I want to go to the cloud or something. And so it seemed like, it just didn't quite meet the need. So Microsoft said, we need something better here. And, Microsoft, of course, knew this AI thing was coming. And so they knew we had to offer something better from a data management standpoint. So they said, yeah, who's been successful? And frankly, the answer was the Power BI team. Power BI has taken over a huge, chunk of the analytics world out there. When you talk about the major players like Tableau and Click and the main competitors there, Power BI just keeps going upward. And it's, a lot of the reasons are the common stuff. When you talk Microsoft, it's easy to use, for one thing compared to other things. A lot of times people just feel it's easier to use. And of course, in the Microsoft ecosystem, we offer a lot of things, including our M365 suite. Well, Power BI just more seamlessly interoperates with a lot of the Microsoft offerings. And that's another big theme you're going to see with Fabric that, we're going to talk a little bit today about other options besides Fabric, because that's really important to know. But I'm going to keep making the case that, hey, you should really seriously be looking at Fabric because of that interoperability that, there's so much just baked in of how it's going to interoperate with tools like M365 Copilot and the M365 suite alone and all those things. So that said, what is Fabric exactly? So I come down here and I mentioned already that If you talk about tools you need to manage data, it starts with storage. And back in the day, you would have said, I need an Oracle server, I need a SQL server, and I'm going to build my data warehouse on that. Well, with Fabric, we offer several storage choices you can pick from within this ecosystem. And so under this data engineering header, I'm going to show you a thing called a lake house here, but that's one of the terms you're going to hear a lot with Fabric, but I'll show you what that's all about. Over here, there's a thing called a data warehouse. The main difference between those two, for those who haven't heard this before, is that you're going to see in this data engineering lakehouse space, it's very notebook, Python coded driven when you say, I want to process data, things of that nature. Whereas over here in the data warehouse, you're going to see there are no options for notebooks and things like that. It's going to look and feel much more like a relational database environment. And so in that place, you're just going to use SQL as your primary language, in fact, your only language, and you're going to build your tables and process data with SQL queries and things like that, with the ability to create store procedures and views and all those things that you're used to in products like SQL and Oracle, et cetera. So that's the main difference between those. Now, the thing is, they are backed by data lake storage, though. So that's really important to know, because that means you're kind of not locked into a product in a way, because when you ingest your data into a SQL server, that is a proprietary product. And once your data is sitting inside that database, you can't really see that until you interface with it, write SQL queries, things like that. With this, it's turning your data into Delta Parquet files that are sitting on that ADLS Gen 2 storage I talked about earlier. And so what that means is the compute and the storage are really separated. And so then when I say that one copy of data that Fabric exposes here, it starts with that, the fact that I'm putting it out there in data lake storage. So that means lots of different engines can now read from that and work with it and things like that. So you're not really locked into just Fabric as a product here. You can say, hey, I want to ingest data into the storage, but I could go use another data product, and you, like Databricks, for instance, could go read from that data and work with it too. So now those two products become very interoperable. And if you have a data science team that really loves Databricks, but your data team, your analytics team, they love Fabric, you could use both. And you can use the appropriate amount of compute to power each of those, and you don't have to pick one or the other any longer. So I think that's a really cool world to be in, where and we're all of course we're kind of competing when you say Databricks is a company and Microsoft is a company, but Microsoft offers Databricks on Azure, and it's a first-party service, and so it's a very good product. Lots of people love it. So one of the big visionary things I think with Fabric was, we're going to create this in a way where it can really interoperate with Snowflake and Databricks and all these other things, right? So anyway, so the rest of this here on the storage part, down here you'll see this thing called databases. That's literally SQL Server inside of Fabric. So when we said you have the proprietary engine, indexes, all those things that come with a relational database, we offer that right here inside of Fabric. And you might have a use case where you say, hey, I actually want the power of a relational database for whatever reason, so we offer it, and it's powered once again by that compute that we talked about, the capacity. This is not you standing up a SQL server. This is you just saying, I want this database component in Fabric, and you have it. And I'll show you in a moment how when you pick any of these components, they're up and running within 10 seconds, and that's all there is to it. Is you say, I want the thing, you give it a name, and it's up and running. And so there's another thing down here called real-time intelligence. If you have a use case where you're generating a ton of data in short bursts of time, so think IoT devices, manufacturing, this is big, data coming off machinery. In healthcare, it's big, people wearing wearable devices, capturing their vital signs all day, 24/7. So you're generating like this huge amount of data, short burst of time. So you need even more premium storage. So like you mentioned storage earlier, Julie, this is going to have an even more premium storage that's optimized for like quick writes and quick reads. And then you can build processes for quick alerting and things like that. So like I said, this is big in manufacturing where you said, hey, I want to be alerted when I think my machine's about to go down ahead of time rather than just reacting to it after the fact. Or if I have a patient that their heart rate spikes, I want to know that sooner than later so I can, address that more quickly than ever. So that's what that's all about. We're not going to deep dive into much of this stuff today, but just letting you know that that's what that thing's there for. And then you talk about ingesting data. Fabric offers, in my opinion, 4 or 5 ways of ingesting data. You see Data Factory represented here. That's a traditional ETL tool. For anybody who doesn't know what that is, that's a tool where you say, hey, I'm going to connect to a data source, I'm going to connect to a destination, and I'm going to pull data from point A to point B. And maybe as I'm doing that, I can manipulate that data. So it gives you a nice workflow to try to build processes to move data from one place to another and process it and things like that. But Fabric offers other things like a thing called mirroring, where you can actually have an interface to say, I'm going to connect to a SQL server. I just want to pull in 50 tables without building these more complicated ETL processes to do that work. I'm just going to have this thing do a real-time replication of my data of those 50 tables. Now, there are trade-offs with that. Number one, that mirroring mechanism may not work when it gets to really huge data sets with lots of activity. Maybe the compute doesn't keep up with that. So then the ETL tool gives you the more flexibility to handle, bigger workloads and things of that nature. But mirroring could be applied to a lot of use cases where it could save you a lot of time. If I have 50 smaller tables that I just need a copy of those going up into my data warehouse, you've got a thing that's saving you a whole ton of time of building processes, right? So the tool is out there, and what you have to find is how these work in your environment and things of that nature effectively. And then, of course, I mentioned notebooks and Python code and things like that earlier. You can use that to ingest data as well. So if you can connect to a data source and write a Python script to say, pull this data in and process it. If you have people that are really skilled in those types of skills, that's another option as well. So lots of options for bringing data into Fabric. And then you see other things here, like I mentioned, the ability to build machine learning models is becoming ever more and more important out there. Well, you can do that right inside of Fabric too. And so once again, now I mentioned that traditionally, if you built a data warehouse in SQL Server, you might go build a copy of a subset of that data called something like a data mart, it's a common term, where you say, hey, I'm going to give the data scientists their own server to use because I don't want them in my data warehouse. With Fabric, you don't have to do that. There's one copy of data sitting out there, and this is where that capacity thing, but I'm going to bring this to my screen real quick again. This thing becomes important to know is that in the other environment over here, you can have separate, so down here, see this thing called workspaces. I could have a separate workspace out there for my data science team, for my analytics team that's building a data warehouse, and I can tie a separate capacity to those different workspaces. So over here, I could build an F64 for my data analytics work. Then my data scientists, they might be doing some heavy duty stuff. So they might need a little more compute. You give them so you build 2 capacities now, tie them to the own workspaces, but within those workspaces, they can be accessing the same set of data. And so that's the beauty of Fabric to me is that now I don't have to set 2 copies of that data up because once again, if I had to do a separate copy of data, that usually means writing more ETL processes. And so pretty soon you're spending 50% or more of your time building all these processes to ingest data, build duplicate copies and all these things, right? So, and when I get to the part of the non-Fabric part of this discussion today, that's what I'm going to kind of focus on is that if you work in that old world, you're going to go back to some of those disadvantages that while it may cost you a little less, and maybe it's not even a matter of cost, it's people just saying, I'm not going to approve this newer tool yet or something. People have to understand that if you make a choice like that, you don't get these advantages you're getting with the more modern, cloud platforms. And I used to really be hesitant to use terms like modern data platform because it sounds so marketing, right? That it's like, is this thing really any different than what I had before? And I can confidently say Fabric is truly different than operating in a SQL server or an Oracle server and things like that. So I'm not going to be hesitant any longer to say modern data platform because it truly is different, right? So back to here real quick, make sure I just touched on. So we talked about the fact you have your storage choices, different choices for ingesting data down here, and then you have Power BI. So you need a reporting tool. Everybody has to build reports. And so Power BI, of course, is Microsoft's answer for that. And so you used to have reporting services out there as well. Well, with SQL 2025, you might have heard there's no longer reporting services. There's a thing called the report server that's still out there for on-premises use, but you're now going to be building Power BI, what's called paginated reports if you want to stay on-prem with this stuff. And you're just frankly not going to get the full feature set of Power BI if you do that. And that's been the same for close to 10 years now. You could do Power BI on premises, you could do it in the cloud. In the cloud, you got a few more features. Well, now more than ever, you've got a ton more features. And a lot of it is, I'll show here a little bit of the AI side of things out there that you're just simply not going to get if you stick to an on-premises strategy for reporting. So, but it's safe to say here that, our answer to reporting here is Power BI. And now the way Fabric was built compared to that other thing called Synapse Analytics, this is truly a fully interoperable way where all these components truly, work with each other. And as you go through the interface, you'll see how you can just hop back and forth within the same interface and do all this various types of work. So before I just show a few of these features for real, any questions or thoughts on any of that? Anybody online, feel free to raise a hand or speak up anytime as well. So if you raise a hand, I should see it pop up. And all right. Let's just walk through a few features here. So I'm going to go to a workspace here I have out here called Healthcare Data. And I have a bunch of stuff already preloaded here, but one thing I said I wanted to show you for anybody who hasn't seen this, when I say I want one of those components, I come up here and I say I want a new item. And so up here, I'm just going to say, yeah, I want this thing called a lake house because I know I want that to store data. I've read about that. I understand it. So I need that component to start. And so I'm just going to call this something weird. And let's see here. So there and all that. And so I just want to show you the power of this is now when I stand this up, it's going to take about 10 seconds here and you're going to see it's out there, right? So there we go. So now that, so Julie's point earlier, that means the storage is there for this. That means all your front ends for this are out there built right in here. And now when I mention front ends for this, I'm going to be walking through this web interface here today. But you can use some of your old school desktop tools against Fabric as well. You can use SQL Management Studio, for instance, and connect to a lot of these components. I'm not going to bring that up here today, but I just want to drop that little nugget out there for anybody who hasn't heard that if you love those old tools that are still being, maintained and added upon every day, those are still usable against Fabric as well. But so anyway, I'm going to close this thing out because I just wanted to show you how quick it is to stand up something like that. So think of that comparatively to the old world. If you said, I'm going to do a data warehouse in SQL Server, you had to go to your VM administrator, or if it wasn't a VM, if it was, actually a server, somebody had to actually allocate hardware to start with. Your VM administrator had to go stand up a server for you. You had to then go install SQL Server. And of course, people with a more mature way of doing this, they would build a more automated way to go push SQL Server to a server over the years. But either way, you're doing all that effort. You're having to figure out what kind of storage do I need that's going to be optimal for this. None of that is happening now. With this, you went out there and said, I need that storage component, and in 10 seconds you have it. And that's because you've stood up that capacity and it powers all this stuff already.
SQL licensing too.
Yeah, well, there's that. I mean,
Like
yeah.
when you're talking physical or virtual
Yeah.
and you're talking SQL Server.
Yeah, SQL licensing is definitely complicated, and this, I showed you what the licensing was for this. There is no licensing. It's an Azure cloud service, and we charge you monthly by the size of that capacity and the storage you use. It's simple as that. So definitely a good call out there because that's another complication in that world. Yeah, no doubt. So anyway, I'm just going to walk through this thing called the lake house really quickly here, just so you actually see this. But, once you stand this thing up, it's the first interface you're going to see here right as it's loading. You'll see across the top that I see nothing about SQL here. So if you come from a SQL Server background, this is going to freak you out a little bit because you're going to say, well, how do I start in this thing? I see tables over here. I see files. Well, what's that mean? Like, I've never worked with files in a database. What does that mean? But what you have here is I have tables. Well, how do I work with these? Well, if you're in this interface right here, I'm just going to bring up a notebook just for anybody who's never seen a notebook before. These have been around in other environments like Spark and everything for years, but this is using Spark Compute behind the background, just to be clear here. So, but what you'll see here, this gives you a way to write code to go do things. Now, I will say if you've never used notebooks, I would say invest some time in learning how to, work with these because they are pretty nice. I mean, the thing is here, this is the thing where you can interact with other people on your team and you can save all this work you're doing. And up here, I write this. So this little snippet of here for anybody who's never seen the concept of a data frame with Python code and things of this nature. This is basically just saying run a select statement against my table over here. So this is actually connecting to some files that are sitting here in Fabric, and it's saying go display that. And then down here, when I run that little snippet, I get my output here. So just think of that as, you're running a SQL statement in SQL Management Studio, but it's just Python code instead of SQL code, right? And so the same thing, if you've never written Python code to work with data, you have to learn how do I update data and all those things. And just to show you real quick, you'll see here, I keep saying Python, but you have some choices here for languages as well. So I have Scala and R. So most of your major data languages are represented here. And there's even a version of SQL called Spark SQL. It's just not the fully featured T-SQL that you got with SQL Server, and that you actually get with the data warehouse feature within Fabric even. So anyway, this is what you need to do if you're actually going to write data. You have to, if you're choosing the lakehouse, you have to work with notebooks to write data, meaning insert new rows, update data, things of that nature. Now, if you just want to read your data, you can come up here to the upper right-hand corner. I'll go back to my lakehouse here real quick. Upper right-hand corner, I can flip to this thing called the SQL Analytics endpoint. And now I'm going to get an environment that looks much more like if you said somebody wrote a web tool to interact with SQL Server, it's probably going to look a lot like this. So up here, I have new SQL query. You'll see nothing about notebooks mentioned any longer. And down here, so if I drill into the schemas down here, you're going to see tables, views, functions, stored procedures. So while I can't do an insert statement or an update statement from this interface, I can write stored procedures to read data and views and functions and things of that nature. I just can't write a stored procedure to say, hey, use a SQL query to go update some data. So that's when I said earlier, there's this thing called a data warehouse in Fabric. The main difference there is all those things I said you can't do with SQL over here, you can do in the data warehouse. And in fact, if you came from mostly a relational data background in your company and your team is mainly people who have always worked with relational databases, you might say, I don't really need to use the lakehouse for anything. But I always start with it because it just offers a lot of, if you have a SQL Server background, I'll kind of safely say you're pretty going to be able to operate within the warehouse with very little effort. But I show the lakehouse because it offers a lot of intriguing things. And so one thing I do want to point out here is when I go back to the other interface from my lakehouse real quick, you notice files down here. So it used to be when you talked about managing data, you talked about structured data, importing data from databases, from Excel files, things of that nature where you have rows and columns. But you didn't really talk about managing PDFs and Word documents and things of that nature because you said, I can't write a SQL query against a Word document. So you treated that as a whole separate world. And frankly, the only way you could really do much with those types of data was that machine learning world. So before large language models came along, people would write, machine learning models that could go read a form and extract certain data from it, and then you would do certain things. But that was more that Python coding sort of world where you had to build a machine learning model, train it, and then it might be really good if the file stayed mostly the same. But if you introduced another format, then the machine learning model broke for you again. And so it was really frustrating working in that unstructured data world where large language models have now changed all that. Like I can take the contents of a PDF document and I can feed it to a large language model and I can say, extract these 15 details, now write a SQL query for me to go and insert that into a SQL server. And you can do all that with a large language model now. And that can be any formatted document. If you have an OCR model that can just extract the contents from PDF, I say all this because now when you have this file section here, this can be really powerful for a couple of reasons. Number one can be say, hey, if I want to ingest an Excel file into a database, I'm quoting here for the people online, in Fabric, I could, upload my Excel file right here to this area. Then I can either write a notebook to ingest it right here, or I could use an ETL tool to ingest it from here. So that's a functional thing I can do. But this can also be a place to manage all your other unstructured data. So now Fabric can be a place where you not only manage all your structured data, but I could say, let's use this whole folder structure I have here to start, building. So rather than using a file server or something where you put all your files in the past, why not put them here? Because now it's up here with all the rest of your data. And I think it's over time, it's going to start making it clear to everybody that, look, the importance of large language model AI and why we need to get started with this is because we've never been able to use all this tons of terabytes of data we had out there sitting in PDFs, and all that's changed now. And so if you start managing it here, I think you can really go into a presentation with your executives and say, look, I've got all this data here, right here, ready to use. Can we get started with large language AI, please, because we want to extract things and get that data out here into a structured data set. And this could really help us with our business. So let's say, for instance, you had a bunch of information about your customers, for instance, and it's all sitting in PDFs. Well, nobody can really use that, right? And frankly, enterprise search systems you might have had in the past just were not very good at finding things because they're all keyword based. And so you type in a 5-word thing and say, search for this, and you get really frustrated because it doesn't come back with what you're looking for. And you may, in testing, there are documents out there that should return, and it just simply doesn't do it. And you worked really hard to try to make those systems better, and then you just couldn't. It was virtually impossible. Well, unless you were Google, right? Google, they had all the time in the world to say, let's make our search engine find certain things much better. But most companies don't have an army of people there just to make your enterprise search engine better. So that said, now with large language models, once again, that's all changed. You can put your documents in a thing called a vector index, and now you can find things, that you could never find before. And so there's so much power of what you can do with that data. So I just really like to point out that the reason this file section is here, it could be just for an operational thing. It's a place I can put my CSV files and load them from here. That's great. But I think there's a big strategic thing here too, that place to manage all your data now and make that very visual for everybody. And so real quick here, I just want to point out, now it's great that I've put all this here, but how do I find things if they're just sitting in file folders? This isn't going to help you find things necessarily, but this is where data governance and Purview can come in, right? So Purview, I'm just going to show you really quickly that everything I'm going to show you here is free of charge in Azure Purview. So if I go in here into Fabric here real quick, I'm just going to show you what it's scanned and found out here. So you'll see here as I drill into this a little bit, you'll see here that, so now I get down to that workspace level. So I'm going to go into the workspace that I was working in. And you'll see here, like all the different types of things it found. So it found under data engineering, we were talking about the lake house. So now over here, you see here that it found my lake house. And so then I drill into the lake house I was just in, and you'll see here files and tables show up. So now within this files area here, in that folder and all the way down here to the individual file level, I can come in here and find things. So let's see here. So now I'm going all the way down to the file level, and I can do things here now like, let's see here, if I do the edit button, it makes this a little more clear. I can put descriptions in here, and I can classify this. And so now with the front end of Purview, once I give it all that extra metadata, I could come out of here and say, hey, help me find files that match this concept or something. And so, like I mentioned earlier, this is the hard work of data governance, is adding all this metadata about every object you have out there. But more than ever, I think it's going to be very important to take the time to do this. And this is where strategy-wise, you have to consider democratizing this. And when I say that, I say, hey, I'm ingesting data from 15 different applications in my company, and one of those is my HR system. Well, I'm going to try to strategize with the head of the HR department and say, hey, we're bringing a bunch of important data from your system in here. Could you have a couple of members of your team be the ones to come into Purview and classify all this data for us? Because we're the technical team or we're the analytics team. We don't know what all this data means. So could you do that? Now that takes a lot of negotiation and a lot of convincing, right? But that's what a data strategy is. Data strategy isn't just building the technical side of it. It's like this business side of it and giving everything more context and everything. So you probably need to build something like a data governance team, and you need to make people feel important. Say like, hey, this is really important for the company. It's really going to help us make analytics better. It's going to help us with our AI endeavors. We need a representative from the HR team on our data governance team, and then get everybody in the room together and talk about the importance. So now you have the individual conversations, but then you bring people into a boardroom together and talk about it as well. And hopefully you convince more people than not that, hey, we should all participate in doing this, because this is good. And then you try to tell the story, well, how is this going to help the HR department? Well, if you need to find information to help you do your day-to-day job, and you want us to help you build AI-driven processes to make your jobs easier, if you can help me here, I'm going to have more resources to help you there, right? And that's, once again, that's all human relations and negotiation and all those things. And if you're going to lead a data strategy, you have to become really good at that stuff. You can't just be the technician sitting in the corner that says, all I know how to do is write good SQL queries. So, but I will say for anybody that's on the call or anything that, your role today is really maybe a database administrator, or you're an analytics person who writes Power BI. This is really going to be a huge need in the industry, and you can really accelerate your career by doing this stuff. Like if nobody else in your company is saying, I want to build a data strategy, you be the one to do it. And so anyway, I'm going to stop on there because I want to get back to finishing up on Fabric a little bit, but hopefully this is a good little quick overview of Purview. But so this is really so if you see Purview out there, you might see a lot of talk about security, and then there's the data governance side. Well, data governance is obviously also has security as part of it, but Purview as a whole is a place where we're offering a lot of security related things. So that's your cybersecurity team. But then there's this data governance side of Purview. We've brought it all together under this one big Purview umbrella. But the part I'm showing here today is the data governance side, obviously. And so I just wanted to show you real quick that you get a lot of value for free. Now, if you want to get to the paid side, just to close off on this, you can do things like do automated rules through Fabric and things of that nature. So you could say, hey, if I see something classified as PHI data, something of that nature, and take some kind of automated, action on that, you can do all those things within Purview, but that's when you get to the paid side of the house. And so the model for that is for every asset you bring into Purview, that can be a table, that can be a database, whatever asset, we're going to charge you 50 cents per month per asset. That's how the cost works for Purview. And that's only if you get into that level of trying to build automation through Purview and things like that, which to me, hardly anybody ever gets to this level, which is simply classifying your data. So I think it's putting the cart before the horse to say, let's worry about that paid side too early. Let's get over this hump first and get the free value out of this tool. But the good story is, like back in the day when I was doing this work, I didn't have a tool like Purview to work with. And so if I wanted to try to build something like a data catalog, I was doing it in Excel or something, because my companies were never willing to buy one of the tools out on the market. I was working for mid-sized companies that didn't have big budgets. So when I said, hey, common data governance tool out here costs 250 grand a year, and this was 10 years ago, they were like, no, that's not going to go through budget, so I was stuck in a world where I'm trying to do all this in Excel or build a database and an application myself. And now you've got this tool out here that's, like I said, all of this is free of charge, which is pretty amazing. So I'll pause there. I've been talking a long time again, just to see any questions or thoughts on any of that to this point.
Were you able to see the asset descriptions and classifications at the folder level, or did you have to go all the way down to the file level?
No, you can see it on every level.
Okay.
Yeah, so every level, if you drill into that thing, you can classify it and everything. Yep. All right. So back to Fabric a little bit here. So I was talking about this lake house thing. That's some storage. Let's just talk about ingestion real quick. So interoperability, you'll see here, I could be working in this lake house. The same would be true if I was working in that other warehouse feature. But right up here, I see get data. And so right here, I could pick like these various tools for ingesting data right from here. And I can say, I want to go build a new data factory pipeline. And so the thing is, the reason I just want to show that real quick is because I don't have to go out of this interface and go over now to the data factory tool to go do my work. I can do all that right here. And when you get done doing all this work, if I bring up my workspace again, you'll see I didn't do a whole lot of foldering and separating things right here, but I kind of do it for a reason, because I want to demonstrate that as I'm creating all these assets, they're all just right here in my workspace that I'm working in. So you see here I have my lake house where I'm storing my data. I have my pipelines that I'm ingesting data. They're sitting right here. I've got these data agents that I'm building for an AI chatbot sitting here. I've got a mirror that's hitting Databricks and that one. So I talked about mirroring a little bit earlier. I'm not going to bring it up here. Well, actually, real quick here, let me show this because this is pretty nice to know. So if I do new item, since we're talking data ingestion, so mirror. So these are all the sources that you can use mirroring for today. So this is mean I'm doing a real-time copy of that data in the Fabric. When I say real-time, of course, that's with some kind of delay, but it's nothing you have to schedule or anything. It's just saying, I see changes on the source, I bring those changes over, and it's maintaining that. You'll see we have this out here now for almost all the major quote databases out there on the market. Now Postgre as a standalone doesn't show up here just yet, but we do have it for the Azure version of Postgre. You'll see we have it for all the Azure databases, but you now have it for on-prem SQL Server. You have it for on-prem Oracle. And when I say on-prem, that could be hosted in AWS or Azure or anywhere as well, right? I'm talking about the version of those that are literally installed by you on a server, right? But we also have it for all of our past versions of SQL, et cetera, too. And you'll see we even have it for Google BigQuery. And Snowflake was one of our very first ones because we had customers saying like, hey, is there a way that you can help us? We're using Power BI. Is there a way we can reduce our cost? And our answer to that was, yeah, if you mirror your Snowflake data in the Fabric, we're not going to charge you for that storage wise or compute wise. And you can now build your Power BI reports on that copy of the data sitting in Fabric, right? Rather than pointing it to Snowflake and running up more charges there. So anyway, that's the story here with mirroring, is that this is a really nice when you launch the interface, it just makes the connection. It shows you the list of tables available. You pick which tables you want to mirror into Fabric, and then you hit submit, and it starts doing the job. Right. So
Are there tools to keep the mirroring going, or?
it just keeps running nonstop at that point.
So like in SQL Server with mirroring, you sometimes have to restart it and fix it and all that. You don't have to do that kind of.
Well, here's the thing. I mean, anything could break, right? So this is obviously here, you're talking about a cloud platform. If you're mirroring back from like say an on-prem SQL, who knows if there could be some kind of networking blip or something that just results in the thing that stops working. I'm not going to say that it won't ever break and you might have to fix it or something, but.
So you would just go into the mirroring here.
Yeah.
And tell it to restart, and it should capture the difference.
You would hope that it could just restart. In worst case scenario, you just might have to start it all over again from scratch or something, right? But it's kind of similar to SQL replication, right? That like I will say myself, I always avoided SQL replication because the first 6 months I used it back around 2002 or something. It broke on me and it was really painful. And I said, you know what? I'd just rather build the ETL processes and move data because I just knew I could troubleshoot those easier. But see, that was my choice. If I said, hey, I'd rather fix replication breaking once every 2 years rather than building and troubleshooting ETL processes, that's a choice you can make, all right? And that's what we're giving you here is choices. We're giving you things that, hey, this is going to save you time on the front end, but you might have to have a really weird troubleshooting, down the road with it too.
You've never run into having to fix the replication.
The mirroring?
Yeah.
I mean, well, I don't work at a company, so I don't use this every day. And I can't say that I'm working with customers who are super heavy into it yet that have complained about it, but I have some customers who are using it and I haven't had feedback that they ran into issues with it yet. But like I said, no promises that it couldn't break and you might have to deal with it, of course. Yeah, just like if your ETL process doesn't run overnight, you've got to go out there and you see the failure, you go rerun it, hope it just works, and if it doesn't, then you go from there, right? So, yeah.
But part of the advantage of that mirroring is it's free versus if you write your own ETL, you're going to pay for the control.
True. Yeah, I mean, that's a big consideration. You say that, yeah, if I'm a company with just one SQL server that I want to use for Power BI or something, and I want to use Cloud Power BI, I could use mirroring to bring it up into Fabric storage, build my semantic model on top of that, and I'm not paying for any of that Fabric computer storage wise, right? So it's a really compelling thing to consider for lots of different reasons, whether it's data warehousing, whether it's Power BI standalone, whatever reason. Yeah. All right, so that's, a little about ingestion. And then, of course, talking about, I get the Power BI now and some of the AI real quick. So if I go back here, I'm going to find this semantic model real quick. So I can talk about a couple of concepts real quick. So down here, there we go. So that lake house I had up earlier on the screen had a handful of tables in it. And so I have this semantic model here that's going to hit about 5 or 6 of those tables. And so you start with this interface and then, so a couple of things here. I'm going to walk through a couple of the AI components of Fabric really quickly here in a moment, but not deep dive on them. But we now offer this feature here where if I want to use a semantic model for some of those, I can prep this a little further for use with AI. What that means is when I launch the screen here real quick, you're going to see the first tab on here says simplify the data schema. Well, I might have built a semantic model, like let's say it's import mode for Power BI, and it's hitting 2 different SQL servers and maybe an Oracle server and an Excel file. I've got all that happening in one semantic model or something. And now, if I want to do AI against that, that's getting a little too complicated for any one chatbot or something. So I want to come out here and just remove some of the items. So that's basically what all this is offering is you can say, I'm going to alter this by just getting rid of some of these fields, getting rid of some of these tables here. And then I'm going to say any AI feature of Fabric I use, it's going to use this version of the semantic model, not the full semantic model, should I choose that model now. And so a really good concept here when I'm talking semantic models is if you're still kind of an on-prem world, some of this is going to sound kind of new, but for Power BI, I know when I first used it, I didn't think of a thing called a data set or a semantic model. I just knew that the interface forced me to say, if I want to bring 5 tables in from SQL Server, I had to define how those tables relate. I had to maybe build some measures and things like that because I knew that could be good for performance. But I didn't really think of it as an asset at the end of the day. Well, now with the way Fabric is built and what we're doing with semantic models become a true asset now. And so when I say that, that's why you've got tools like this to try to help you prep it a little better where you don't have to build another model all the way from scratch. But I will say, if you're going to do AI things, it's not a bad idea to say, let me build a custom semantic model just meant for that. That's not meant for both Power BI and AI or something, because if you get in the game of, but the reason we do this is because you might have a history of building 500 semantic models, and maybe you want to just use those and not rebuild from scratch. So this gives you a way to kind of start prepping that a little bit. And so now when I dive into the semantic model itself, just to point things out, I mentioned earlier, I have to define how the tables relate. That's what these lines here are all about. But some really nice things to know now too is that when I come into things like, an asset here, I've got things like these description fields, et cetera, here too. Well, for AI, I can give more context to AI-driven things by simply putting more information in here. And a common thing I run into with customers is they say, hey, my table name is this here. I've even renamed it in my semantic model to be better for something, so even I can just read it better. But I don't have the abbreviation for that out there. Well, I can stick the abbreviation for in the description field, and now when I use the AI-driven features, it's going to take all of that into account now. So that's what I just want to close up on that by saying, when I say semantic models have truly become a huge asset inside of Fabric, that's what I mean here is there are a lot of features you can use these with, not just Power BI. So Jill, I don't know if you were gonna say something or not. Okay, yeah. So that said, from here, now one of my use cases, I want to go build a report just like I've always done. And so here, you right here from the same interface, I'm just launching now. Now this is opening a separate window, but it's still the same Fabric interface. And now I'm in my Power BI building interface. And so most people still today probably build their Power BI reports through Power BI desktop tool, and you can still do that. But you do now have this web interface. And I will say, if you're going to use Fabric data to power your Power BI reports, there's no reason to probably go to Power BI desktop. Why not just do it all here within the web interface, right? But so that said, I can approach this just like I always have. I can start picking fields and everything, and it's automatically going to start generating some stuff. But this is where AI starts to come in, is that, here I've got Copilot now, and I can come over here and I can, type in some words here, and I can say something like, I can say something like build a page, showing claims by state, something like that, right? And so this is going to now just auto-generate content. So from a developer standpoint, this could help you be more productive. But I think the more powerful story with this that I'll show in a moment is that this Copilot could be used by end users as well. So now you as a developer could be building this Power BI dashboard, and now you release it for use, but then people say, well, now that I see this, I have some further questions to ask. And rather than having to come back to you and say, well, put further charts and graphs and everything on this dashboard, they could be doing this themselves. And so when I say that, I'm going to come back here real quick and I'm going to launch a report. So go back to my workspace here. And let me see here. I've got a report sitting out here on that same semantic model. And so what I'm talking about here is now, and you've got to flip this on for it to happen, but in my environment, I've said, yeah, go show Copilot for my end users. So they've launched this report and Copilot's sitting right up here. If they click on it, they get that sitting over here on the right-hand side. And you can see it looks a little different than it did for me as a developer. It's trying to say like, look, I'm, seeing the semantic model. I see some things. Do you want me to do some things here? Or do you just want to, type in questions and start asking questions? So that's part of the AI story here within Fabric is that you've got Copilot for Power BI. And I have one customer now that's really starting to dig into this because they had an executive who saw this in a presentation and they wanted to start. I'll say this is pretty bad practice, but they wanted to start with a really complicated semantic model that had, hundreds of tables in it. It's one they've been developing for 2 years, but they're using it and it's working and they're just doing what they can to make it work better. Now, the thing is, back to that prep your data for AI, you've got the description fields, you can put more info in, but it actually has another big description thing where if you've heard of the concept of prompt engineering with it when it comes to AI, that's you giving the AI model more context that it uses every time. You've got a free text field where you can type in up to 10,000 characters to also give it more information. And so that's a lot of stuff you can do in the background to make this work better. And so the more complicated the model, though, obviously the more questions people could be asking. So when it comes to AI, that's a whole different story about how do you get your company ready for AI? What are the things you need to do if you're going to put something like this in front of people and all that? But the nice thing to know, though, is that it's here, it's ready for use, but it all starts to me with data management first, because if you put this in front of people and the data is not, as clean as it should be and all those things, you haven't taken the time to say that this abbreviation equals this full word thing that people use every day. This isn't going to be very useful for people, because if they were to type in MNDA or something and you said, well, that's just not going to show up for you. They say like, well, everybody I talk to refers to it that way, so they're not going to be very happy if you release a chatbot where they can't use common business terms that they use in their daily lives, right? So there's a lot that goes into this, and then training people what it's going to be good and bad at and all those things. But today, I didn't really want to get too deep into AI here. I just want to present it as this is the end game of all this more than ever. It's not just, how can I be better at building dashboards, but people are going to start expecting more and more that you present these AI-driven things as well. And you've got to be ready for it. And it starts with data management. So hopefully, going through Fabric here is just kind of clear that Fabric itself is just an all-encompassing tool for all this stuff. It's got all the tools you need. It's powered by that one set of compute. It's, to set it up and start working, not complex at all. We didn't talk about security at all today, but I will say this is all driven by Entra ID security. So every component of this, all the way down to row level in your data, column level in your data, you can be defining who has access to do what, who has access to what data in Fabric. And once you set those rules, if I build a dashboard now on that data, or I have a Copilot hitting that data, it's going to respect those security rules. So that's another big advantage of the Fabric ecosystem is you don't have to tell a separate thing you've developed how to interpret your security now. Fabric that's built into the thing. So that's another huge advantage on the side of this. That said, I've gone 70 minutes now here, mostly talking about Fabric, but let's get back into a couple of slides here that I have. So there are other options in Microsoft to do all this still, so if you want to say, I want to go to the cloud and do this, I can mention, for instance, I mentioned Databricks and Snowflake are obviously options for you as well. They're out there available on Azure. But I will say some of the downsides with those compared to Fabric, depends on how you look at it. I'm just calling it a downside, is that you don't have an ETL tool built in, for instance, on those tools. Now, Databricks does offer ways to ingest data through their Spark engine and things like that too, but it's not your traditional ETL sort of tool, right? So if you really want a tool like that, you have to go use a third-party tool. So most customers I work with that are using Databricks, they're using Azure Data Factory, for instance, because they say, like, I need a tool like that to ingest my data and schedule my processes. So now you're paying for Databricks and you're paying for an ETL tool. And then you say, well, I need a reporting tool. So I need Power BI or Tableau or one of those choices. So, the story here is that if you make those other cloud choices, you're going to have to buy other things alongside that as well. And that means all those things don't interoperate as seamlessly and everything too. So that's a big advantage on the side of Fabric. But you can also say, like, well, some of those tools are frankly more mature than Fabric in some ways too. So there's a flip side there that you could say, maybe I'm willing to pay a little more because I know Databricks is really good at X, and Fabric looks to me like it's not quite ready to do that yet. So that's a consideration too. But other choices you have are just, hey, you say, like, hey, I'm not ready to invest in those bigger cloud-based platforms, but maybe I want to go to the cloud. Well, if it's in the Microsoft world, that's what we're focused on here today, is I do have, Azure SQL out there. And you can see here, there are these 3 flavors of Azure SQL, in case you're not familiar with this, that I have, SQL Server on a VM. So I can stand up a VM in Azure and put SQL Server on it. And in fact, there's a way to do it where you don't have to literally install SQL. It's just wrapped into a package and you can stand that up. But then you're managing a VM, right? That means you're managing your backups and everything individually. So all the stuff that comes with managing a SQL Server, Oracle Server, things like that. SQL Managed Instance and Azure SQL, you can see here, these are labeled as PaaS services. That's because these do have some cloud advantages where my backups are baked right in. They're just there, they're automatic. The only control you have over them is maybe the frequency and things like that. But even then, there's not much flexibility. They're just built right in. And when you say, I want to restore a database, you go into an interface and you say, I want to restore this to a point in time. It stands up a copy of your database side by side, and it does it to that point in time. You don't have to think through, like, what backup files do I need to go find to do this and all that stuff, if you weren't using like a third-party mature backup solution of some kind.
So it manages if you have full or differential or transaction.
Right. It just does those automatically. Yeah.
So if you have something really large, you don't know what it's doing behind the scene.
Well, it just does all that. It just says, I'm going to do transaction log backups on a certain schedule, and it does the differentials and it does the full on a schedule. All right. So, and like I said, there's not much flexibility for you to pick that. It just does it. And that's part of the value of doing a PaaS service. And if you say, I want to use SQL Server and I'm going to build a data warehouse, I would say you want to pick one of these PaaS versions because you get a lot of that cloud value with that, right? Where once again, the theme here is, how do I take work off the shoulders of my technical team so they have more time to do the data warehousing work that really matters, the building reports, building AI solutions and all that. Those resources aren't going to magically come out of a budget somewhere. You've got to get creative on how do I free up time for people. And so to me, cloud is obviously always been a way to do that. And these things become more mature over time. Now, when you look at the list price of these compared to building on-prem SQL Server, anybody who's judging it on cost alone, they're going to say, well, that makes no sense for me because it costs more. But it's like, well, you've got to take all these other factors. And so if you're going to go cloud and you haven't done it yet, you have to have a cloud strategy. Just like a data strategy, you've got to have a cloud strategy. And you've got to say, well, I'm going to put numbers on the fact that I know that using these tools will take X percentage out of my staff's day of the work they do. So I can now allocate those resources. In fact, I'm about to write an article that I'm going to release this week on kind of data-driven management, where I say I think as managers, we all have to get better at knowing what our employees do specifically and what are they spending their time on. And my case I'm going to make is that the easy answer is start making them do time entry or something. It's like, no, don't do that. Put it on yourself as a manager to, like, when you have your one-on-ones or your team meetings, go, ask them, what are the things you're working on? Ask a few key questions. What are the things you're working on? How much time is that going to take to finish that project? This is all their opinion, of course, but you have to gather this data, and then you put it into a system and put a report on it. So now you can see if you're building a cloud strategy, I could say, well, now if they're doing those same sorts of activities, I know I can remove backups from a certain percentage of what they're doing, right?
Resolving backup failures. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. That's my point, is that now if you have that data in front of you, you can make a real cloud strategy case because you can show all the numbers. But as a manager, you have to have that data. If you've never, I've worked with so many managers that frankly simply don't know what their people do. They just know, like, well, I just hear that people are happy with what you're doing. That's cool. That's really all they know. And it's like, well, you're never going to be able to build a cloud strategy if that's the way you approach business, right? So anyway, so that's, in SQL Server, you can build your data warehouse, but I've said a lot of this already, but that means you're going to need an ETL tool still. You're going to need a reporting tool still, right? And all that stuff's not going to interoperate. So, you're back to, so if you feel like, hey, I'm saving a little cost by not going to Fabric because I'm going to use Azure SQL instead, well, you got to take all that other stuff into account now. And which becomes complicated to figure all that out, right? And so that's where you could say, well, I could just be lazy and just pick Fabric and be done with it, but you got to have the budget for it. So I think you really do have to think through all this and compare them side by side and all that. And then, here's a slide where I just said, yeah, these are some of the value you get in the cloud. I get automated backups, long-term and all this. And you have other options too. So this is showing a diagram that's showing PostgreSQL. So, there's PostgreSQL in Azure, and if you like PostgreSQL better than SQL Server, then you've got that too. You could host Oracle in Azure as well. But then, the other thing you could say, well, I don't even want to go cloud. I want to stay on-prem. Well, I could stay on-prem with SQL Server, Oracle, all the same thing I've always done, but we kind of talked through this already, where if I do that, then once again, if I have an on-prem reporting tool, it's just simply not as good as the cloud version of Power BI, for instance. But if I do go on-prem, SQL Server, of course, so I'm talking SQL 2025, I just brought this up on the screen just to say, yeah, SSIS is still out there. So rather than me having to use Data Factory, a cloud tool to go move my data around and process and all that, I do still have SSIS, and it's still a very powerful functioning ETL tool, right? So, but you have to build these processes. You see here, I'm working in Visual Studio, and I've got to go maintain these, and it's just a harder thing to do than if I'm building Data Factory things up in Fabric. It's just simply harder to manage. I don't think anybody can debate that. But still a very usable tool, and I can't imagine Microsoft is going to take this one away, because if you're going to be on-prem, you need an on-prem ETL tool. It makes no sense almost to say, I have an on-prem application SQL Server and an on-prem data warehouse SQL Server, but I'm going to use a cloud ETL tool that's going to move data through the cloud and back to on-prem again. That makes no sense, right? Now, some people aren't doing that. They pick third-party ETL solutions and they're doing exactly what I said, but that's going to be slower. So I can't imagine Microsoft taking this away because this is still a very, very valuable tool that works really well. I can't say I've written an SSIS package in 4 years now, but last time I did, it was working great. And when I just did it here over the last week or so to get ready for this is still working great and all that. So just wanted to kind of bring that up and say, but like I mentioned, we have taken reporting services away. So now you have to get used to the fact that if I'm doing on-prem reporting, that thing that I used to have that nice interface, Power BI paginated reports are just a little different. You got to get used to how those work and everything. So I will say just a lot of value. So to me, you could say there could be a hybrid approach as well. Like for instance, I could say, I'm going to use Fabric, but I'm only going to use it to a certain point. Like I'm going to use it to build reports, but maybe I'm going to maintain an on-premises kind of central repository, but I'm going to take some data from there and move it up into Fabric storage. And if you were to do something like that, you could even use SSIS to push your data up into Fabric. Like nothing says you have to go build an ADF pipeline in Fabric to pull your data into Fabric. You can connect to Fabric with SSIS and push data up to it. So once again, this kind of gives you a lot of flexibility, but I think if you don't go all in on Fabric, you're simply going to be sitting in a place where it's just harder to maintain all of this and everything. So while I label this session, all options in the Microsoft ecosystem, I think you're pretty clearly hearing me say that, yeah, you can still do this in a SQL Server driven way, et cetera, for data management and all these things. And Purview can connect to SQL Server too. So don't forget that as well. So there's a way to do it, but still lots of more time spent managing data that way. Simple as that. And in my opinion, your companies are going to be doing AI things sooner than later. That might be 2 years down the road. It might be 3, it might be 6 months, but it is going to happen. And the people who are thinking about that now and getting ready for it are just, those businesses are going to be successful. And the ones who don't, AI is going to be that big. It already is. I see the healthcare companies that I work with, there are companies that are all in on AI and they're building things where their nurses are much happier. They build things where, hey, I used to have to go look up things about this patient. It took me 30 minutes to 60 minutes to do it. I did that 3 times a day. Now they're giving an AI solution where it takes them 10 seconds to get that same information. And now those are things that without AI, maybe you could have built those things, but AI is reminding people that, hey, you need to do these things, and they're doing it. AI is making it easier to build the things more than ever, and nurses are happy. That's a huge statement to say, I made my nursing staff happier with technology, because someone who was in a leadership position at Mercy here in St. Louis, she said, every technology solution I was given for decades, I never felt they made my life any easier. And a lot of times they actually made it harder. And she said this AI-driven thing, it made everybody within 2 days, they were coming to my door saying how happy that this made them. That's powerful, right? And so I just say all that because when I say AI is going to do this, I'm not just saying it from a marketing standpoint going, of course AI is going to do this. I'm already seeing it myself where people are seeing the value of it. And so if they start applying that to every business problem you have, the companies who do it, they're simply going to be better. And their competitors are going to be left, scraping along, and, like their customer engagement's not going to be as good. Their sales process is not going to be as good. Their day-to-day operations aren't going to be as good. And it's going to be night and day because AI is going to have that kind of impact. And so data management is going to have to be a huge first step to drive all that, though. And so the companies that are off and running, they had really good data management programs already. So when they said, I need data for something, they knew that the data was ready for prime time because they'd invested in that. But so many companies have not still. Yeah. So hopefully I didn't wander too much today, and this was kind of semi-easy to follow my message here, but yeah, just really want to kind of present that, yeah, there are still ways in the Microsoft world and in other competitors as well to do data management without Fabric, but there's a big but there that, in my opinion, I think you're going to need to look at cloud-driven solutions like that to make this all successful in the long run. Yeah. So.
Well, thanks. That was good.
Any
Yeah.
other questions or?
What's the reaction from companies, or do they ask about Fabric? Like we have a customer in Fabric, how do I back this stuff up? You need to get the classic.
Well, my answer for that, number one, there is a DR solution for Fabric. And so number one, anything you put in an Azure region, so it's easier to forget that it's an Azure thing because the only thing you manage in Azure is that capacity, right? Then you're doing all your work over in powerbi.com. Well, the thing is, when you put Fabric out there in a region, first of all, you get 3 data centers, and it's automatically replicated to those 3 data centers. So if any one data center goes down or something, you've got that backup right there. But now if it's a case that's more like, hey, I went in there and deleted this data, well, you have to keep in mind, most of your activity in Fabric is probably going to be data warehousing related, right? So that says if you blew away a table there, do you really want to go through the effort of restoring some kind of backup and then re-ingesting the data? Or do you just go run your ETL process that just repopulates the table anyway? Right. So in my opinion, like I feel like in data warehouses, there's never been as much use for like a traditional backup, because if you build it all the right way, where you have your full loads, incremental loads to pick from and things like that, you just say, go run my full load and I've repopulated all my data. Now and that's going to take less time than restoring a backup and still doing the same thing. You still have to repopulate the data, right? So why not just run the ETL process and repopulate? So that's my answer to it, is that now if they said, well, I'm using SQL Server in Fabric, then that's different. Yeah. But everything else, though, I think it follows that pattern. Yeah, like when I was doing data warehousing in SQL Server, if somebody accidentally deleted a table, they never said, go restore the backup and do that. They just said, run the process to repopulate it from the source again. And now, given that, hopefully you wrote your ETL process in a way where it doesn't put a bunch of load on your application during the middle of the day. And if even with SSIS, you always had features in there where you could say, make sure you're only grabbing small chunks of data at a time, so you don't put a full load on your application server. Yeah. So that's usually my answer. It starts there. And if they say that's not good enough, then we go deeper and whatever. But there are DRs, you can do DR for Fabric where you literally have it copied to a separate region and all that too, right? But
Eric.
Wondering about doing the mirroring for DR.
well, so the thing is, so if you talk about Fabric, it's all the components, right? So if I've written 50 ADF pipelines and I've written 50 reports, you got to do DR for all of that, right? So that's why, then you say I've got to do a DR strategy, not just for my data, but I got to do it for all the components. And so we have really deep documentation on this, is how you would set up DR for Fabric, because it isn't just a flip of a switch. You do have to treat all the components kind of one by one, and it's a little hairy, but most DR setup is, I mean, it always has been and nothing's changed with that.
There's no questions online. I wanted to thank you very much. A very interesting topic. And, trying to get us to jump back into Fabric. That's a serious solution, especially what you were saying with that AI component.
Well, I'm just talking big picture here, I mean, it's one thing to talk data management in a silo and just say, oh, you should do that, just like people have been saying for decades, but I think AI is changing even that now where it's more critical than ever.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.